Hi, my name is Aidsand Wright-Riggins, and I wanted to respond to some of the questions proposed during this African American History Month. One of the questions that was raised was, how has my experience of faith freedom differed from those of the religious majority? And what might I emphasize about my faith tradition that might be ignored or erased? And so I want to preface this by saying that I come from that segment of the Baptist faith tradition that is rooted in the African American experience. And one of the things that may be unique about that experience, and especially in the Baptist segment of that tradition, has been the licensing and the ordination tradition in the African American church. I happen to have been licensed to preach when I was just 9 years old. In fact, I was licensed on June 19th, 1960. And if you hear the words June 19th, that might automatically raise a flag in your mind in terms of Juneteenth, because Juneteenth was a day of the acknowledgement of freedom, of the proclamation of freedom, the Emancipation Proclamation of freedom for African Americans in this country. So I take a great deal of pride and symbolism about having been licensed to preach in the African American tradition on Juneteenth, 1960. I went to college and I went to seminary and then began to prepare for ordination. When I began to prepare for ordination, I had a choice as to whether or not I was going to be ordained in my own local church, which they fully expected that I would, or whether or not I would seek a different kind of ordination. At that time, I chose a different kind of ordination. And that ordination, from my perspective, was one that was broader and more diverse, that brought in a larger family of Baptists, and that was in the American Baptist tradition. I was ordained on May 7th, 1975, with the blessings of the Ministerial Concerns and Standards Committee of the American Baptist Churches of the Pacific Southwest. I took pride in that ordination largely because it said to me that here were different people from different theological perspectives, liberal, conservative, progressive, fundamentalist, people of different racial hues coming to the family with a multiplicity of ways of understanding what our faith was. And so I chose and celebrated the fact that I was ordained in that tradition. 36 years later, our denomination fractured. It fractured over the issue of homosexuality, different views about human sexuality, as well as different views about how one uses the Bible. I was devastated by that. I was devastated by that, not because I agreed or disagreed with persons that had different perspectives than my own, but I was devastated by that because this family, which I assumed had a notion of faith freedom, that said it is our faith freedom that makes us interdependent and gravitate towards each other, that some took that faith freedom to mean that we could separate and divide ourselves from each other. So one of the pieces that hangs on my wall, in fact, is my ordination certificate, and one of the things that it reads is that it comes from the Ministerial Concerns and Standards Committee of that particular expression of the American Baptist Churches, USA. It still hangs on my wall, but I question whether or not I am actually, in fact, still recognized by that particular region, because that region pulled out of the denomination. That region changed its name, and my ordination credentials are held or were held by that body. So it is painful. And so part of what I want to say is that when we talk about faith freedom to me, from the perspective in which I'm rooted, is one coming again from that Juneteenth 1960 experience of freedom, my racial freedom, political freedom, also being related to my religious freedom, was one that says I am obligated to embrace those who are different than myself, rather than saying, because of my faith freedom, I need to build a wall around myself or separate myself from someone else. So, yeah, this faith freedom business is more than simply words on a page or something that we spout, but rather I think it goes in many ways to the core of who we are or who we say that we might be. So particularly in reference to that question, what do I wish that others understood? What I wish that others understood, it is that it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. And when we recognize our own freedom, when we recognize our own embracement and inclusion by Christ, I think that that calls us to embrace others who are different than ourselves. So, yes, I have a different theological perspective. Yes, I have a different view of human sexuality. Yes, I have a different view about race and racism. Yes, I have a different view about the Bible. But because of that faith freedom, it says to me that I'm called to stand at the table, to sit at the table and sit at the table with others, as opposed to excluding them. So, yeah, so I've got this ordination certificate that I'm not sure is still valid. And I have my original Juneteenth 1960 ordination. You might be able to see that it's so old you cannot even see the words that are printed in ink on this document. But although these words are no longer visible by being printed in ink, they live upon my heart. I believe that it is important for us to recognize the differences between us, but at the same time to embrace those differences, because faith freedom ought to draw us closer to each other rather than building walls with each other. So that's the way I see it. And as others would say, so that's the way it is. Thank you.